title screen says Understanding Employee Performance, Turnover, and Well-Being Data. Graphic identifies speaker as Michelle Graff, Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development, she/her.
Hello, I'm Michelle Graff. I'm the director of the Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development, or CWVE. I'm also on the faculty at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center on Children, Families, and the Law. I'm joined today by my colleague, Megan Paul. Megan?
Graphic identifies speaker as Megan Paul, Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development, she/her.
Hi, I'm Megan Paul, also at the UNL Center on Children, Families, and the Law. I'm a research associate professor, and I am the workforce lead on the CWVE.
Thank you, Megan. The CWVE is a Children's Bureau-funded initiative which seeks to build knowledge on effective workforce practices in child welfare. We have a number of resources from the CWVE that we'll be sharing with you today, and we hope you'll check out our website to take advantage of everything the CWVE has to offer regarding child welfare workforce. Today, we'll be talking about how to better understand and manage your agency's employee performance, turnover, and well-being, using data that you likely already have been collecting or can begin collecting fairly easily. We'll start off explaining the idea of evidence-based human resource management, and then we'll explain some types of workforce data, including data that pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we'll walk through a case example to illustrate how you can use some of these data strategies to dig down to better understand your agency's performance, retention, and well-being. Along the way, we'll point you to a number of resources that we've developed that we think are really useful tools for doing this work. So let's get started. Similar to the national current focus in child welfare on evidence-based practices, the approach that we're sharing with you today stems from what's referred to as evidence-based management. But in this case, it's evidence-based human resource management. Evidence-based management is about managerial decision-making and organizational practices being driven by conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of the best available evidence from multiple sources. I'd like to underscore a few key points here, that we're talking here about decisions and organizational practices being driven by the best available evidence. So let's talk about what types of evidence we have available that you could draw on in this context. There's 4 major types of evidence that you can draw on for evidence-based management. The first is the scientific literature. At the CWVE, we've created research summaries, which we've called umbrella summaries, and you can use those to get to a very quick, easily understood summary of the key points and advice and what is the level of evidence on a wide variety of workforce topics. The second source of potential evidence is professional expertise among practitioners. And this can refer to specialized knowledge that's acquired through repeated experience and practice. Particularly important here in this context is the role of both child welfare managers and administrators and your agency's HR professionals. They are key players here, and their collaboration is really essential for maximum effectiveness. A third potential source of evidence are the values and concerns of your stakeholders, and you're accustomed to taking those into account. Finally, the fourth type of evidence is internal organizational data, the data that you already have or that you can collect within your agency. And that's our focus today, workforce-related data. And we'd like to help you think about how to have that data help drive your managerial decisions and your organizational practices around your workforce challenges. So next, we'll talk about some different kinds of workforce data that you have available to you in your organization that we think can be tremendously important and useful to you in tackling workforce challenges. And there's 3 main categories of workforce outcomes that your agency likely has data on. First is employee performance. Second, employee retention and turnover. And third, employee well-being. All 3 of these are really important outcomes But it does seem like retention and turnover tend to get the most attention, especially lately. So we want to look at some examples of all three types of workforce outcome data. First of all, types of performance. And the point here is to realize that your agency likely has a lot of different data on different kinds of employee performance that could be relevant to helping you decipher your workforce challenges. So here are some examples on the slide. You'll see training performance, and that could include things like knowledge test scores, skills evaluation scores, field observations, completion of assignments in training, conduct in training. And then job performance data could include things like task quality, timeliness of completing tasks, professional conduct on the job, or how you interact with other employees or the families that you serve, organizational citizenship behavior, how employees contribute to the greater good of the organization, disciplines, and rehires. So all of these are types of performance data that you likely have available to you right now. As far as retention or employee turnover, your agency's information on turnover is actually a lot more layered than just your turnover rate. The first consideration is, well, what even constitutes leaving? What do we even mean by turnover? So employees can leave their position, they can leave their job, their office, a region or area of the state, a division, or leave the entire agency. And these are layered. And you see on the graphic on the slide how these are layered and concentric circles. Obviously, they aren't mutually exclusive, but you'll want to think about exactly what or where employees are leaving and where they're going, because each of these might have different meaning for your agency and how you calculate turnover. Each of these departures means something different. Depending on your goals, some of them may not be as critical. For example, if an employee leaves their job, but they stay within the agency somewhere, that kind of internal turnover can be considered a win because your institution is gaining that knowledge in another position. And so they're not leaving the agency altogether, and their knowledge is still available and contributing to the agency. People often want to advance to get career advancement or expand their skill set. And so that shouldn't be considered a negative. However, every movement out of a position, even if the worker stays in the same job, but they move to another city, for example, or another office, it's a loss to the families that are working with that worker and to the work team. And it has administrative costs as well. So broadly speaking, these distinctions fall into two different categories of turnover, either internal or external. And agencies will often focus on their external turnover, which is very important, but we want to encourage you to also be thinking about internal turnover as well. Beyond the internal and external distinction, there are some other categories of ways of describing turnover. One common distinction to consider is whether the departure is voluntary or involuntary. And by voluntary, we mean that it's initiated by the employee. An involuntary turnover is when it's initiated by the agency. Agencies usually have data to to calculate these two types of turnover. And perhaps you've heard this distinction when your HR folks might provide you with turnover summaries. Another distinction is whether the turnover was avoidable or unavoidable. Avoidable turnover means that the employee's departure could have been prevented by the agency. And factors that might cause the employee to leave are under the control of the agency. This could be things like workload, supervision, training, etc. Unavoidable turnover means the opposite. The employee's departure could not have been prevented by the agency, by anything that the agency did. So this would be turnover because of illness or retirement, or the employee's spouse is relocating to another part of the country, or pregnancy. So for these, we wouldn't suggest guessing based on the employee's stated reasons for leaving. Instead, we would suggest that you conduct an exit interview or an exit survey that directly asks whether their departure was preventable or not. And you can phrase it as, was there something that the agency could have done to prevent you from leaving? Finally, the last distinction that we consider is whether turnover is functional or dysfunctional. With functional turnover, the employee's departure is a benefit to the agency. And when we say benefit, we mean, it could be a number of ways, but most typically we're defining it as losing someone who's a poor performer. So it's a benefit to the agency that a poor performer has left the agency. Like avoidability, this data for this is typically not just readily available. To measure it, we'd suggest that you ask supervisors to provide you with a few ratings, such as the overall performance of the person and whether they would rehire that person. And that would allow you to determine whether that turnover was functional or dysfunctional. Now, one caveat about functional turnover, although it's good in the sense that poor performers aren't with you anymore, if there's a lot of that happening, it's really not, great for the agency. And so you'll want to explore to figure out what are those underlying reasons. Why are we having so many performers poor performers leaving the agency? Why are there so many poor performers in the first place, right? So you need to look at underlying reasons such as your hiring process or your training, or perhaps your performance expectations, or the way performance is being managed by supervisors. So in summary, who initiated the turnover? Was it under the agency's control? And was it beneficial? And again, the point of all of this is that if you factor in these three distinctions when you're calculating turnover, you result in a much more nuanced approach that will allow you to have a better diagnosis and management of your turnover situation. Now, the third category of organizational workforce data is about employee well-being. And there are a wide variety of attitudes and perceptions that you could include when you think about employee well-being. And a number of them are listed here on the slide, such as job satisfaction, secondary trauma, psychological safety, organizational culture, coworker support, the level of civility, feelings of inclusion and fairness, organizational commitment, and others. These are mostly data that an agency would have to capture by doing employee surveys. So these aren't data points that you'll normally just have. You need to actively gather them. You may already be surveying your employees with an annual or semi-annual survey to gain insights on some of these topics. So here's a simple example of how these three types of outcome data can complement each other as you analyze a workforce issue that you might be experiencing. Let's say you wanted to better understand your agency's retention for employees who were recruited to you using three different methods. And let's say they were, website advertising. Another way of recruiting was job fairs. And a third method was through employee recommendations. So you have these three ways that you've recruited employees, and you're asking, what are the outcomes based on the different ways that we recruit employees? You want to know, are the job fairs worth taking the time to put into that? Because sometimes that can be very labor intensive to go to job fairs. Are we getting good hires out of them? So that's the question here. So you could work with HR to break down the data that's already pretty much existing within your agency and look at what percentage of employees who are hired using each of these three recruiting strategies are still with the agency after 1 year on the job, and what percentage are still there after 2 years on the job, and compare that. You could also add to that the average performance rating that these employees that are recruited in those three different ways have received. And finally, you could compare the three groups on their average job satisfaction rating taken from your most recent organizational surveys. So when you break down your data like this, It can be really enlightening for understanding which of those 3 recruiting strategies are resulting in employees who will stay, who are good employees, good performers, and are happy with their job. Now, beyond recruiting, you can also do the similar kind of thing with data about the effectiveness of each of the typical processes in the employee life cycle. For example, you can look at data about recent hires' perceptions of the onboarding experience that they had. Or you can gather data about how employees perform in training. Or you can survey employees about their views of the professional development opportunities that your agency offers them. For all of these, your HR representatives can be really valuable allies and partners in this, and we encourage you to seek them out to collaborate with you on this. One of the resources that we're sharing in the resource list is a brief on how to improve working relations between HR and child welfare program leadership, and we encourage you to take that into consideration. So now I'm going to turn it over to Megan to talk about data segmentation. Megan?
Thanks, Michelle. So when you start examining your data, a key strategy for analyzing it is what's called segmentation.
Graphic identifies speaker as Megan Paul, Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development, she/her.
You might also have heard of it as disaggregating. Michelle's alluded to it throughout, but without that name. It's the process of breaking down big data into smaller, more meaningful groups to get more insight. So what Michelle just showed you with the turnover and this example is actually a way of segmenting turnover data. So instead of just looking at turnover overall, it's valuable to drill down and look at different types of movement or leaving. So I'm going to give you a variety of ways to what we call slice and dice your data into meaningful groups. And I'll cover some examples here. These blue squares across the top represent the unit of categorization. So for example, we have agency structure, leadership, demographics, recruiting, role structure. And the dashed green squares underneath represent the data segments. So like for time, we have month, quarter, or year as potential segments. Of course, you could divide those into other segments as well. You could drill down on any of these categories to get more precise information about the outcome you're interested in exploring. So for example, you might be interested in exploring employee tenure, and then you could split it by geography, by education, recruiting source, job function, or other things. And then here are just a few more ways that you could segment your data on job attitudes, performance, turnover, and training and professional development. For example, you might be interested in looking at how work performance or retention varies as a function of employees' job attitudes or participation in mentorship or coaching program. So I hope you can see how all the possible combinations you could have here when you start segmenting or disaggregating to really drill down to better understand things. As a more concrete example, you can start with overall turnover data, then you can split it by voluntariness, then by job, then by region, and finally by recruiting source. So if you did all that drilling down, in the end, you're going to have this final metric that shows voluntary and involuntary turnover for each recruiting source by region for the job in question. So segmentation allows you to examine your workforce data with more precision, so you can better see areas of concern and opportunity. You start comparing these things and you see, where are things troubling and where are they good? And start to think about what might account for those differences. When you segment your data, you can start to see potential risk factors. That is the conditions or factors that are associated with some undesirable outcomes, such as poor performance, turnover, well-being challenges. Sometimes these can be root causes that you can directly tackle. So you can start to see, if you did a segmentation, you see an area where something is very problematic, you can start to explore the factors, and you might find some risk factors that you can directly tackle. So like sometimes with like children and families, the workforce related risk factors can't be completely eliminated though, so they can possibly be mitigated, right? So then you're looking for potential protective factors that might offset the risk. So maybe you can't solve the problem, but maybe you can offset the problem. So for example, you might find that the workload and stress are risk factors, and you might have a challenge adjusting those. You might be able to include supportive supervision and supportive coworkers that can offset that risk and serve as protective factors. So these are the things that the workforce data can be used to explore, especially when you segment. The last major type of workforce data that I want to share today is diversity, equity, and inclusion data. So here you see our brief definitions. Diversity refers to the degree of differences in composition of your workforce in terms of group or social identities, which I'll elaborate on shortly. Equity refers to the degree of fairness in treatment and outcomes for employees. Just as we have disproportionality in outcomes for children and families, we often have them for employees in terms of workforce outcomes. And then finally, inclusion refers to the degree to which employees feel respected and valued, regardless of their social identities. And we'll talk about in a minute too. Inclusion can also be thought of in terms of the actions or the inclusive behaviors that lead to feelings of being respected and valued. So I'm going to go over each one of these and talk about data, starting with diversity. So here's a very simple example for one type of social identity, race. We have a table here with various categories of race, and these are pulled from the US Census. Aligning your data with census is useful because they offer community data that may be helpful as you consider your labor pool. I'll talk in a minute why it's important to know the demographics of your labor pool. So then they would match when you compare them. However, some other categories might make better sense for your community and to make sure that employees feel included when they're asked to share their race, because you don't want people to feel othered to the extent that you can avoid that. We know that on the analysis side of things, you might need to collapse categories, and that's fine. But what's important is, what are people feeling and experiencing when they're being asked this question? Also want to point out that they should be allowed to select more than one race so that they're not forced to pick an identity. Even though you see here on this table that it says it says 2 or more races, that's done behind the scenes in the analyses when you need to collapse them if you don't have enough people in certain categories to do proper analyses. But point being is that on the question side of things, people feel included. Let's see, the bottom line then, is just to be really thoughtful about how you ask the questions at the beginning here. The other thing, as you're exploring social identity, diversity rather, is to consider other social identities, as you see here, visible and invisible. And you may also want to consider intersectionality, how multiple identities combine to create additional groups. So you see we've got also ethnicity, age, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, religion, disability status, age, language, and other social identities. And so this is where segmentation, can become particularly very valuable to see diversity and possibly inequities, which I'll get to in a second, that might be hiding when you just do these very large overall analyses of your data. So let's say this is the racial diversity of your frontline staff. The simplest way to analyze diversity data is to calculate the number and percentage of employees in a given identity category. So you can see here, I've got them in descending order. White, 68%, Black or African-American, 18%, and then it descends from there into smaller groups. So knowing an agency's workforce composition can be really useful on its own, but it really doesn't tell you too much more about whether it's sufficiently diverse or equitable and so on. So a simple way to explore diversity is if you're able to get information from your local labor pool, about your local labor pool rather, and there's various sources for that. They can be available through the US Census Bureau and maybe other state and local sources. Then you can compare the two to see where you stand. So the goal is for your workforce to reflect the diversity of the available talent pool that meets hiring qualifications. And the simple analysis here is called a utilization analysis, standard way of assessing this. You can see it's very simple to calculate. It's the getting the labor pool numbers that's the hard part, right? So the math is easy after that. So positive numbers reflect overrepresentation, and negative numbers reflect underrepresentation. Note that this analysis is not indicative of discrimination at this point, but it can give you a sense of whether you need to look at your personnel practices. Now, in terms of developing diversity or representation goals, you can use this information to do that with some cautions. Optimally, like I said, I want to underscore this, your workforce should reflect the diversity of the available talent pool that meets hiring qualifications. So that's the first criterion. People have to meet the job qualifications, okay? Then you want to consider your recruitment, hiring, promotion, and retention strategies. Those are all the ways you can change those numbers. But I want to emphasize you cannot give preferential treatment based on protected classes or status in a particular group. The goal instead is to remove barriers to ensure equal access and opportunity, right? So you're not going to look at those numbers and be like, well, we're going to stop hiring a whole bunch of people in this group because we're overrepresented. You're not going to do that. Nor are you going to say, we're going to start hiring more of this type of person. You want to start looking at all of your processes, including your recruitment strategies, to try to make sure you're really tapping your pool. Now let's turn to equity. So equity is the degree of fairness in treatment, access, opportunity, and outcomes for all employees, with particular attention to those that are members of protected classes. And we have listing a couple here: race, color, age, that is 40 and over age, disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and pregnancy, religion, and national origin. There are federal laws and state laws as well that protect these classes. We know from research that there are differences in treatment and outcomes based on many of these factors in the realm of personnel practices such as recruitment, hiring, professional development, promotion, performance evaluation, compensation, on and on. So they are really important to examine with or without the laws. But they are very important to be aware of. So you should be mindful of those as you're exploring these things. The primary strategy for assessing equity is to segment or disaggregate any workforce metric by group identity variable of interest to see if there are differences between groups. So you can look at lots of personnel processes related to recruitment and hiring, training. You see the theme here. We keep saying these: training, professional development, performance, discipline, absenteeism, etc. Those are the types of personnel processes you want to be looking at, particularly for personnel decisions that are made by the agency, versus by the applicant or the employee. So dismissal versus resignation, let's say. There are specific analyses that can be done to examine if there are substantive differences, like really meaningful meta threshold kind of differences in areas such as hiring, discipline, promotion, or termination. These kinds of differences, when they meet a certain threshold, are called adverse impact, and they can result in legal liability and have to be rectified. I'm not going to go into those details here. They're not terribly complicated, but probably more than you want to know about right here. But further details about this can be found in our DEI handout in the handouts pod or in the resource center. So here's another example of how to further look at turnover in terms of comparing these groups from a DEI perspective. So here we have external turnover. In this case, we're examining it by race and ethnicity. So in this first column of our table, we have white, not Hispanic origin, Black, not Hispanic origin, Hispanic, and then Asian or Pacific Islander, and American Indians or Alaskan. And they're also in descending order, with the highest turnover being 64% among whites, 20% among Black, not Hispanic origin, and then descending further from there, big drop off, 6, and 3%. So you can see how they vary, but of course, given the likely variation in the number of people in these groups in the first place, this information doesn't really tell you very much. So you should also consider their representation in the job. So now you can compare and make something, to see if there's more disproportionality in leaving. This isn't the most technical and proper analysis, but this gives you, it's an easy thing to look at and interpret pretty quickly. So you can see where there may be disproportionality in leaving. And the most noteworthy findings are in the second row of this table for employees who are Black employees of not Hispanic origin represent 20% of the external turnover, but only 9% of the workforce population. So this would certainly be something to further explore and perhaps get into some more advanced type of analyses to make sure to see what's going on here. In addition to doing a more advanced analysis of adverse impact, you could also look at do more of that segmentation to see if there are some regional differences or some other factors that might account for it. You could always get to the point of even maybe focus groups to really drill down and do some root cause analysis there. Another way to explore equity is to measure applicant or employee perceptions, typically through surveys or focus groups, so not administrative data. So here are some examples of the types of employee perceptions that would be relevant. Michelle already mentioned many of these. These are the employee well-being types of variables, engagement, job satisfaction, stress, organizational commitment. Others are more directly related to matters of equity. So you see there fairness, discrimination, civility, and ostracism that are really getting at the perceptions of equity. And so in all of these, you could gather employee information data and then start breaking it down and doing that segmenting by group identity. So it's really important to gather those as part of the survey and explain to people why you're gathering that information if they're hesitant to share that. So by now you should be thinking about how you could segment survey results to see if there are lots of different ways to explore differences among people. And we encourage you to do that. Last one is inclusion. Again, like I said, that's the degree to which employees feel respected, accepted, supported, and valued, regardless of their gender, race, ethnicity, age, disability, other social identities. Again, we want to reiterate that some people, this term has sort of evolved, especially in the last several years. So some think of this as more a reflection of what would be called belonging. That is how people feel. And instead define inclusion in terms of behaviors that leads to these feelings. Regardless, though, which definition you go with, measures of both are pretty limited. So there are a number of belonging measures out there, but they're for community, for family, school, et cetera. So there's not a whole lot on the workforce front, but the handout that we have on this provides a lot more information about it, and definitely encourage you to check it out. So now I'm going to turn to a hypothetical example here to just give you more information, ideas about what this could look like to think about and apply some of the concepts that we've just shared. So here we've got a child welfare agency is concerned about their timely initiation of CPS assessments, as well as the quality of the risk and safety assessments. Turnover is also an ongoing problem, which results in higher caseloads for stayers. No one's heard of this problem, right? So the question is, how can the agency better use workforce data as one means to understand these issues? And I want to emphasize one means to understand these issues, because you wouldn't rely on it exclusively. Before we dive into that, I'd like to highlight one of the handouts called a brief workforce needs assessment, which includes many potential questions to consider as you explore your workforce data. So the idea there is to really take your time to be thorough and systematic in understanding your workforce issues, rather than just jumping to attempted solutions. So lots of questions and data to look at. So here, returning to our example, we've got presenting issues. We have some job performance concerns. Remember, Michelle shared a list of those. Specifically here, we've got issues with task quality, with risk and safety assessments, and task timeliness with investigations. We also have turnover as a potential factor. So these are just the presenting issues. We're going to use the example of data to enhance our understanding. So let's zoom out and look at turnover more broadly to illustrate the process of drilling down. So let's say we're focused on the child welfare worker job, all roles. I'm going to give some annual turnover rates here because they're easiest for people to interpret. But You may want to focus on shorter, more recent periods of time, depending on the duration of this problem. So for the sake of illustration, I'm going to use annual turnover rates. So the external turnover rate is 25%, the internal is 16%, leading to a total turnover rate for this job of 41%. So that's the rate of the kind of turnover that can affect children and families, and very likely affects coworkers, supervisors, and HR as well. So let's drill into that a little further. So we'll start with the breakdown for external turnover. Here you see both the number and percentage of people in each category. So for you see in the first row, we have resignation as a type of turnover. There's a large portion there, 42% is due to resignation, people choosing to leave, which is pretty common, right? Not maybe that number, but that's the top reason. A small amount is due to retirement, 5%, and 14% is due to people being dismissed, that is terminated. Like Michelle said, on the one hand, this is considered desirable turnover, right? Because probably if they were dismissed, there was, an issue with their performance. But on the other hand, that's quite a few people. That's 57 people that we wouldn't mind having stay if we could get them to perform well. So that's something to look at, and it's not desirable in that sense, because of the numbers. The next three rows are focused on internal turnover. So you see that 8% of the overall movement is due to promotion. And assuming a strong, valid promotional process, this is a good means of retaining institutional knowledge and providing a clear career ladder. So that's, functional kinds of turnover and movement. And then we've got 7% of people who've been reassigned. So this is generally due to performance issues. Their probation period is over. So dismissal isn't nearly as easy, and this varies by agency, what your local state laws are. So they're retained, but moved to a different job, either temporarily or permanently. So collectively, we're seeing that 21% of movement, that is 1 out of 5 people, are due to performance issues, which is a lot, and a lot of people that you want to explore that. So let's think about how we might do that. So to further investigate this, here are some questions to answer around dismissal. From where are these people being dismissed? What office, what supervisor, what particular role? Why are they being dismissed? Are there trends in the types of issues that you're seeing? And are they relevant to any of our presenting issues here, like task timeliness and completion? And when are they being dismissed? For example, relative to hire or completion of training. So again, you can see, I hope, where segmentation is going to be key here, just to drill down, to use some additional personnel data and possibly some qualitative data to get answers here. Likewise, you'd want to ask similar questions for reassignment. Where are they going from? Where are they being reassigned to, and why, and when, under what circumstances, not what time of year or anything, but relative to hire or relative to being done with training. And then finally, in the bottom row, we have a lot of people transferring into other positions or jobs. So lateral moves. Again, this is a lot of change for families and an opportunity for further investigation using these same questions. From where to where, why, and when, to help us understand and really drill down, could be powerful means of understanding turnover. So we've chosen to highlight the value of doing that for other types of turnover besides voluntary external turnover, the one we're most used to thinking about, right? Because other types are often neglected, I feel. And this same process should be applied to voluntary external turnover as well. But we're kind of used to doing that, right? Why are they leaving? Let's do some exit interviews or stay interviews. Why are they staying? But looking at these other types of turnover is really important. So that's the big picture on turnover. Let's try to get a little closer to the issue at hand here. So we're looking at turnover here by role. So in this table, we have role or functions. We have intake or hotline, investigation or initial assessment, or whatever you call it, ongoing, permanency, and adoption. And so we're looking at the external turnover rate. I want to emphasize this is the turnover rate. Unlike the last table where it was percentage of each group, this is the turnover rate in each category. Because it's clear, it takes into account the number of people that are in these roles, because the number of people in these roles varies, right? And I want to compare those to the overall turnover rate of 25%, just so you have a benchmark. So you can see that intake and adoption are lower. The overall is being 25%. They're at 15 and 18% respectively. And so they're lower than the overall, but the rate is highest among people who are in investigation and IA roles at 38%. So now let's consider internal turnover, keeping in mind that the overall internal turnover rate is just 16%. Again, the highest rate here is for investigation and initial assessment at 21%. So they're not just leaving the organization at a higher rate, they're also leaving the role, but staying in the agency in some way. So that's sort of some good news and helps you think about how to explore what's going on. And then let's just add one more variable. We've got average tenure at turnover. And here again, you can see that it's shortest for the investigation and initial assessment role at 17 months compared to a few years in other roles. I should mention these are hypothetical data, so don't walk away with any conclusions from these data. Based on a true story, but adapted here. So don't walk away saying you've heard some data about this. So collectively, we've established that the movement is more problematic in the role in question in our scenario. So, and there's more we could look at with the right data. You could further break down the external and internal rates and look at specific types of movement, and that might tell you more. So again, we're hoping you can, if you're really into this, you can start to think of what about this? What about this? I would want to know this other thing. So data leads to more questions, which leads to more analysis and more data to really get some answers. You could also switch from your administrative data to data around employee experiences. Given that we see retention differences based on their role, we could look at employee perceptions of their perceived fit within their job. And my hypothetical example that just happens to work out, on a 5-point rating scale, you could see that the average rating of fit is lowest for the investigation and initial assessment role. So that would be something to further explore. Likewise, you could add supervisor support ratings. Again, in my hypothetical example, works out well here that the average supervisor support rating is lowest among in this role and higher in others. And finally, you could do burnout, which is highest here in this role. And then you could segment further, perhaps by geography or employee demographics. So we're not going to go into it further here, but you could also look into your 2 performance metrics: timeliness of initiation of investigation and quality of assessments, and look at both administrative data and qualitative data for employees about the barriers they're encountering. So again, the point here is to use your data to do a thorough diagnosis of workforce issues before making decisions about how to handle them. And I just want to underscore again that you'll want to work with HR for all of that. By all means, please don't just send everyone to training, which is a common strategy for performance issues, because a lot of these issues are not due to lack of knowledge or skill. Michelle?
Thanks, Megan. So we know that was a lot of information. The good news is that we have a lot of takeaway resources, which you can find in the handouts pod or in the resource center. And again, we want to really encourage you to check those out. Megan already mentioned the needs assessment guide. And in addition to that, we have greater details on how to do that data segmentation that she illustrated. We have a great handout on a variety of workforce metrics. There's one on measuring DEI, and there are a number of resources on measuring turnover. Some of these are written resources, white papers or short documents, but we also have some videos. And so if you enjoy watching short videos on some of these topics, we have those available as well. If you have found any of these ideas potentially useful for your organization, we really want to encourage you to refer to the resources and also to check out the CWVE website, quick-wd.org, for many other workforce resources. So our call to action, finally, our call to action to you is this. First, we encourage you to adopt an evidence-based management approach to exploring and addressing your workforce issues. Among other approaches, really try to make the most of your workforce data. And in order to do that effectively, you'll want to partner with your HR folks. They can help you identify what data are available, and they can help you use that data to inform your decision making. If they aren't currently available, you can work with HR to figure out how to start collecting the data that might be most useful to you. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We hope you'll enjoy the upcoming CWVE sessions and have a great day.
Slide says this video was developed for the Child Welfare Virtual Expo by the Capacity Building Center for States and is sponsored by the Children's Bureau. Its content does not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the Children's Bureau.